You know that feeling when your phone buzzes at 11:47 p.m. and you see your grandson's name on the screen? Most grandmothers would assume it's a pocket dial or maybe he's asking for money again. But when I read those 4 words that Michael sent me that night, my blood ran cold. Grandma, get out now. What happened in the next 3 hours changed everything I thought I knew about my quiet suburban neighborhood, my late husband's past, and just how far some people will go to keep their secrets buried. The story I'm about to tell you involves corrupt city officials, a 30-year-old cover-up, and one 17-year-old boy whose gaming obsession accidentally uncovered a conspiracy that nearly cost me my life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Chen, and at 73 years old, I thought I'd seen everything life had to offer. I'd raised 3 children as a single mother after my husband David passed away when I was 45, worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, and somehow managed to put all my kids through college. Now, in what I assumed were my golden years, I was living quietly in the same house David and I had bought in 1978 in Riverside Heights, a small town about 40 minutes outside Portland, Oregon. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the biggest excitement is usually the annual Corn Festival, and where people still leave their doors unlocked. I'd been widowed for 28 years, and while my children constantly urged me to move into one of those senior living communities, I wasn't ready to give up my independence. My house on Maple Street was modest but comfortable, with a garden that David had started and I'd maintained all these years. The neighborhood had changed over the decades. Young families moved in and out, kids grew up and left for college, and slowly, many of my original neighbors had either passed away or relocated to be closer to their children. But I stayed put. This house held too many memories, and I wasn't about to let some well-meaning children shuffle me off to play bingo and eat pudding cups for the rest of my days. My youngest daughter, Sarah, lived about 2 hours away in Seattle, with her husband and their son, Michael. Michael was 17, a senior in high school, and like most kids his age, he was practically attached to his computer. The boy was brilliant, I'll give him that. He'd been accepted to MIT for computer science and was planning to start in the fall. But Sarah worried constantly about his screen time, his lack of social interaction, and what she called his unhealthy obsession with online gaming, and what he called digital investigations. She'd roll her eyes when he'd spend hours researching random topics that caught his interest, diving deep into public records, news archives, and what he called data mining. To Sarah, it looked like he was wasting his time. To me, it looked like he had inherited his grandfather's curiosity and analytical mind. David had been a journalist before he died, specializing in investigative reporting for the Portland Tribune. He'd always been the type to dig deeper when something didn't add up, to ask the questions that others were too polite or too scared to ask. I used to tease him that his suspicious nature would get him into trouble someday. I never imagined that 28 years after his death, his old stories would nearly get me killed. Michael and I had always been close. While his mother fussed about his computer habits, I encouraged his curiosity. When he was younger, he'd spend summers at my house, and I'd tell him stories about his grandfather's reporting adventures. David had covered everything from city council corruption to environmental scandals, and Michael was fascinated by the idea that you could uncover truth just by knowing where to look and being persistent enough to keep digging. As he got older and more skilled with computers, he started helping me with little things. He'd research contractors when I needed work done on the house, help me understand confusing medical bills, and once he even tracked down a long-lost friend from high school that I'd been wondering about for years. What I didn't realize was that over the past few months, Michael had been conducting what he called a digital archaeology project on our family history. He'd been scanning old documents I'd given him, digitizing photo albums, and researching newspaper archives to create what he planned to present as a graduation gift. A comprehensive family history that would include not just photos and family trees, but also historical context about the places we'd lived and the events that had shaped our lives. It sounded like a sweet project, the kind of thing that would make me cry happy tears at his graduation party. I had no idea that his innocent family research was about to uncover a secret that certain people in Riverside Heights had spent 3 decades trying to keep buried. The trouble started, though I didn't know it at the time, about 6 weeks before that terrifying night in March. Michael had been scanning through old newspaper clippings that I'd saved from David's career. Most of them were routine stories, but he was particularly interested in a series of articles David had written in 1994 about irregularities in the city's water treatment facility contracts. At the time, it had seemed like typical small-town politics. The city council was being accused of awarding contracts to friends rather than the most qualified bidders, some money couldn't be properly accounted for, and there were questions about whether the new water treatment systems were actually up to environmental standards. David had interviewed several city officials, including the mayor at the time, Harold Brennan, and the head of the Public Works Department, a man named Thomas Ridley. The story had run for about 2 weeks, with David publishing follow-up pieces as he uncovered more information. But then, suddenly, the story just stopped. David never wrote a conclusion to the investigation, which was unusual for him. When I'd asked him about it at the time, he just said that the sources had dried up and the story wasn't going anywhere. Looking back now, I realize how strange that was. David was never one to let a story go unfinished, especially when he smelled corruption. Michael, with his 17-year-old determination and his grandfather's investigative instincts, decided to see what had happened to that unfinished story. Using his computer skills, he started cross-referencing the names David had mentioned with current city records, property ownership databases, and business registration files. What he found was interesting enough to keep digging deeper. Harold Brennan, the mayor from 1994, had left office in 1995 and moved to Florida, where he died in 2003. But Thomas Ridley was still around. In fact, he'd done very well for himself over the past 30 years. After leaving his position as head of public works in 1996, Ridley had started his own consulting company, Ridley Environmental Solutions, which had since become one of the most successful environmental consulting firms in the Pacific Northwest. The company specialized in helping municipalities navigate environmental regulations and secure federal funding for infrastructure projects. What caught Michael's attention was that over the years, Ridley's company had been awarded dozens of contracts by cities and towns throughout Oregon and Washington, including several very lucrative contracts with Riverside Heights. In fact, according to the public records Michael was examining, Ridley Environmental Solutions had been paid over $12 million by various local governments since 1996, with nearly $2 million of that coming from Riverside Heights alone. That might not have seemed suspicious on its own. After all, Ridley clearly knew the environmental consulting business. But Michael noticed something odd in the timeline. Many of these contracts were awarded without the competitive bidding process that was supposed to be required for government contracts over a certain dollar amount. And in several cases, Ridley's company was brought in to fix problems with water treatment facilities that had been installed by other companies in the 1990s. Problems that, if they had existed back then, should have been caught by the environmental oversight that Ridley himself had been responsible for when he worked for the city. Michael's teenage brain started connecting dots that maybe a more mature, more cautious person might have left alone. He began to wonder if the unfinished investigation his grandfather had been working on was connected to what looked like a pattern of very profitable environmental cleanup contracts. Had David uncovered something in 1994 that someone didn't want him to publish? And if so, what had happened to make him stop investigating? Being 17 and fearless, Michael decided to dig deeper. He started researching not just the business connections, but the personal ones. He looked up property records, marriage certificates, business partnerships, and family relationships. He created what he called a relationship map that showed how various city officials, contractors, and business owners were connected to each other through business deals, family relationships, and property investments. What he discovered was a web of connections that stretched back decades. Thomas Ridley hadn't just gotten rich from environmental consulting. He'd also invested heavily in real estate, often buying properties that later became prime locations for development projects that his company would be hired to manage the environmental aspects of. Several current city council members had business relationships with Ridley's company, either as employees, contractors, or through family members who worked there. But the most interesting connection Michael found was between Thomas Ridley and the current mayor of Riverside Heights, a woman named Patricia Morse. Mayor Morse had been elected 3 years ago on a platform of environmental responsibility and government transparency. She'd promised to clean up what she called the Old Boys Network that had been running the city for decades. But according to Michael's research, Patricia Morse's husband owned a construction company that had been awarded several city contracts, and that same construction company had partnered with Ridley Environmental Solutions on multiple projects over the past 5 years. Furthermore, Patricia Morse's campaign for mayor had been heavily funded by something called the Riverside Development Foundation, a nonprofit organization that, according to its tax filings, was primarily funded by donations from Ridley Environmental Solutions and several companies that had received city contracts over the years. To Michael, this looked like exactly the kind of corruption and conflict of interest that his grandfather had been investigating 30 years ago. But instead of a few $1,000s in questionable contracts, this appeared to be a system that had generated millions of dollars in profits for a connected group of people over 3 decades. The smart thing would have been for Michael to present his research to his family and let the adults decide what to do with it. But Michael was 17, and he'd inherited more than just his grandfather's curiosity. He'd also inherited his sense of justice and his belief that wrongdoing should be exposed, no matter how powerful the people involved might be. So instead of talking to his parents or me, Michael decided to do what he thought his grandfather would have done. He started reaching out to people who might be able to help him confirm his suspicions and gather more evidence. First, he tried to contact some of the sources his grandfather had interviewed back in 1994. Most of them were either dead or no longer living in the area, but he managed to find 2 former city employees who had worked in the Public Works Department during the time period David had been investigating. Both of them, when Michael called and explained who he was and what he was researching, immediately became nervous and told him
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Couldn't talk to him. One of them, an elderly woman named Betty Morrison, who had been a secretary in the Public Works Department, actually seemed frightened when Michael mentioned Thomas Ridley's name. She told him that he should let sleeping dogs lie and hung up on him. That reaction, instead of discouraging Michael, convinced him that he was onto something important. So he tried a different approach. He started researching current city employees, looking for someone who might be willing to talk to him about irregularities in the contract awarding process. Through social media and public records, he identified several people who worked in City Hall, including a woman named Jennifer Walsh who worked in the finance department and had posted several social media updates over the years, complaining about waste and mismanagement in city government. Michael sent Jennifer a carefully worded message through LinkedIn, explaining that he was researching his grandfather's old journalism work and was hoping to understand how city contracting processes had evolved over the years. He didn't mention his suspicions about corruption, but he did ask if she'd be willing to talk to him about how environmental consulting contracts were typically awarded. Jennifer agreed to meet him for coffee, probably thinking she was helping a high school student with a family history project. What she didn't expect was that Michael had prepared a list of very specific questions about contract procedures, budget allocations, and oversight processes. During their conversation, Michael learned that there was indeed significant frustration among some city employees about the way certain contracts were handled. Jennifer told him that environmental consulting contracts in particular seemed to go to the same companies repeatedly, often without the competitive bidding process that was supposed to be required. More significantly, Jennifer mentioned that there had been several instances over the years where city employees had raised concerns about potential conflicts of interest or procedural irregularities, but that those concerns had been quickly shut down by senior management. She specifically mentioned that about 5 years ago, another finance department employee had been fired for what she called asking too many questions about a series of environmental remediation contracts that had cost the city nearly $500,000. Jennifer also told Michael something that made his blood run cold. She said that about 2 weeks ago, she'd been approached by someone from the mayor's office, asking whether anyone had been requesting information about old city contracts or environmental consulting agreements. When she'd asked why they wanted to know, she'd been told that there were concerns about people trying to dig up information that might be misinterpreted, and cause unnecessary problems for the city. The timing wasn't a coincidence. Michael realized that his phone calls to former city employees and his research into public records had been noticed. Someone was aware that David Chen's grandson was asking questions about the same issues his grandfather had been investigating 30 years ago. That should have been Michael's cue to back off, to talk to adults, to maybe contact a real journalist or law enforcement. But he was 17, he was angry, and he was convinced that he was carrying on his grandfather's important work. Instead of being smart and cautious, he decided to be bold. Michael's next move was to try to contact Thomas Ridley directly. He found Ridley Environmental Solutions, business address and phone number, and he called the company pretending to be a journalism student working on a project about successful environmental consulting businesses in the Pacific Northwest. He managed to get through to Ridley's secretary and arrange a brief phone interview for what he said was a school project about local business success stories. During the phone call, which Michael recorded, he asked Ridley general questions about his company's history and growth. Ridley seemed happy to talk about his success, mentioning that his company had built strong relationships with municipal governments throughout the region, and that those relationships had been key to the company's growth. But when Michael asked more specific questions about the company's early contracts with Riverside Heights and whether those contracts had helped establish the company's reputation, Ridley became much more guarded. The conversation took a distinctly uncomfortable turn when Michael mentioned that his grandfather had been David Chen, a journalist who had covered environmental issues for the Portland Tribune in the 1990s. There was a long silence on the phone, and then Ridley asked Michael exactly what kind of school project he was working on and which school he attended. Michael, realizing he'd made a mistake but trying to cover for it, said that he was just interested in learning about his grandfather's work and how the environmental consulting industry had developed since then. Ridley's response was cold and professional. He said that he remembered David Chen, that David had been working on some stories about city government back then, but that those stories had been based on misunderstandings and hadn't led to anything significant. He suggested that Michael should focus his school project on current environmental success stories rather than quote that wasn't accurate to begin with. The phone call ended abruptly, and Michael was left with the uncomfortable feeling that he'd just made a serious mistake. Ridley now knew that David Chen's grandson was asking questions about the same topics that had gotten David's investigation shut down 30 years ago. What Michael didn't know was that within an hour of their phone call, Thomas Ridley had made several phone calls of his own. First, he called Mayor Patricia Morse, explaining that David Chen's grandson had been asking questions about old city contracts and seemed to be trying to continue his grandfather's investigation. Then he called two other men who had been involved in the city government back in 1994 and were still living in the area. All three of these men had been mentioned in David's original newspaper articles, and all three had profited significantly from city contracts over the intervening years. The problem they faced was that they didn't know how much information Michael had actually gathered, or who else he might have talked to. David Chen's investigation in 1994 had been stopped because they'd been able to pressure his editor at the newspaper and threaten David's job security. But this was different. Michael wasn't a professional journalist with a boss who could be pressured. He was a 17-year-old kid with computer skills and no adult supervision over his research. Even worse, from their perspective, Michael's research was taking place in an era when public records were much more accessible online, when social media made it easier to track connections between people, and when digital documents could be copied and shared instantly. If David Chen had been able to uncover concerning information using 1990s investigative techniques, there was no telling what his grandson might be able to discover with modern technology. The decision was made during a conference call between Thomas Ridley, Mayor Morse, and a man named Frank Delano, who had served on the city council in 1994 and was now a successful real estate developer. They agreed that Michael needed to be discouraged from continuing his research, and that the discouragement needed to be strong enough to ensure that he would stop asking questions and delete whatever information he'd already gathered. Their plan was simple but effective. They would use Frank Delano's connections in the community to spread the word that Michael was asking questions that were making people uncomfortable. They would make sure that no one else would agree to talk to him, and they would arrange for him to receive some clear warnings that continuing his research could have serious consequences for him and his family. Frank Delano owned several rental properties in Riverside Heights, and he'd maintained relationships with people throughout the community. He started making phone calls to business owners, former city employees, and community leaders, explaining that there was a young man going around asking questions about old city business, and that people should be careful about what they said to him because he might be trying to cause trouble or create problems for the city's reputation. More ominously, Delano also reached out to some less respectable connections he'd maintained over the years. Frank had grown up in Riverside Heights back when it was a rougher place, and he'd never completely severed his ties to people who were willing to handle problems through intimidation rather than legal channels. He arranged for a couple of those people to keep an eye on Michael's activities and to make sure the teenager understood that his research wasn't welcome. What none of them had anticipated was that Michael was smarter and more careful than they'd assumed. After his uncomfortable phone call with Thomas Ridley, Michael had realized that he'd attracted unwanted attention. So instead of backing down, he'd started being more careful about how he gathered information and where he stored it. Michael had learned about digital security from his online gaming and his computer science studies. He started using encrypted email accounts, storing his research files in secure cloud storage, and communicating through platforms that were harder to monitor. He also started sharing his findings with online communities of amateur investigators and journalists, creating backup copies of his information that would survive, even if something happened to his own files or if he was forced to stop his research. Most importantly, Michael had started keeping his grandmother Margaret informed about what he was discovering. At first, he'd just been sharing interesting stories about his grandfather's old work, but as his research had uncovered more serious allegations of corruption, he'd begun to worry about his safety and the safety of his family. 2 weeks before that terrifying night in March, Michael had driven down from Seattle to spend the weekend with me. Ostensibly, he was helping me with some computer problems and scanning more family documents. But really, he wanted to talk to me about what he'd discovered and get my advice about what to do next. I remember that weekend clearly now, though at the time I didn't fully understand how serious the situation was becoming. Michael seemed more serious than usual, more mature. He spent hours explaining to me what he'd learned about Thomas Ridley's business connections, the pattern of city contracts, and the way money and influence seemed to flow between the same group of people who'd been in power for decades. He showed me documents and charts he'd created, relationship maps that looked like something from a detective movie. The evidence he'd gathered was compelling, but I was worried about what he was getting himself into. I told him that if he really believed he'd uncovered corruption, he should take his information to the FBI or the State Attorney General's office. Let professional investigators handle it instead of trying to play detective himself. But Michael was frustrated with what he saw as adult caution and bureaucratic slowness. He'd contacted a journalist at the Portland Tribune, the same newspaper his grandfather had worked for, but the reporter had seemed uninterested in a story based on research conducted by a high school student. Michael felt like adults were dismissing his work because of his age, just like they'd dismissed his grandfather's investigation because it was inconvenient for powerful people. During that weekend visit, Michael also told me something that should have alarmed me more than it did. He said that over the past few weeks, he'd noticed cars parked on his street that he didn't recognize, with people sitting in them who seemed to be watching his house. His mother had dismissed this as teenage paranoia, but Michael was convinced that someone was keeping track of his activities. He'd also received what he described as, quote, weird phone calls, where the caller would hang up as soon as Michael answered, and someone had apparently tried to break into his car while it was parked outside his school. Nothing had been stolen, but the glove compartment and center console had been searched through. I told Michael that he was probably being overly cautious, that he was letting his investigation make him paranoid. But I also made him promise that if anything genuinely frightening happened, he would contact me immediately, and we would figure out how to handle it together. What I didn't know was that the people Michael had inadvertently threatened were already making plans to ensure that his investigation would stop permanently. The week after Michael's visit, things began to escalate quickly. Frank Delano had arranged for 2 men, Carl Murphy and Steve Bassett, to keep closer tabs on Michael's activities. Both men had criminal records and were willing to handle problems for people who could pay them well. Their instructions were simple: find out how much information Michael had gathered, who he'd shared it with, and what it would take to make him stop his research permanently. Carl and Steve started by following Michael more closely, tracking his movements between school, home, and the places he went to conduct research. They discovered that he'd been visiting the Riverside Heights City Hall regularly, spending time at the King County Library researching historical records, and meeting with people who had connections to city government. More concerning from their employer's perspective, they learned that Michael had been in contact with several journalists and that he'd posted some of his research findings in online forums dedicated to investigative journalism and government accountability. The information was already spreading beyond Michael's personal research, which meant that simply stopping Michael wouldn't be enough to contain the situation. Frank Delano and Thomas Ridley realized that they needed to take more decisive action. The plan they developed was brutal in its simplicity. They would arrange for Michael and anyone who might have copies of his research to have accidents. Michael's parents would be killed in what appeared to be a car crash while driving to visit Michael's grandmother. Michael himself would disappear while hiking alone in the Cascade Mountains, a victim of the dangerous terrain that claimed several hikers every year. And I would die in a house fire that would destroy both me and any physical documents or computer files that Michael might have left in my possession. 3 deaths that would appear unrelated and accidental, but which would eliminate everyone who had access to information that could destroy careers, businesses, and reputations that had been built on 30 years of corruption. The plan was set for a weekend in March when Michael was scheduled to visit me again. Carl and Steve would handle the logistics, making sure that all 3 accidents happened within a few hours of each other to prevent any of us from warning the others. What they hadn't counted on was that Michael had become genuinely skilled at digital surveillance, and that he'd been monitoring not just public records, but also private communications that he'd learned to access through methods that weren't entirely legal. 3 days before the planned weekend of coordinated quote, Michael intercepted a series of encrypted emails between Frank Delano and Thomas Ridley discussing the final preparations for what they called cleaning up the Chen problem permanently. The emails didn't spell out the details of their plan, but they made it clear that Michael, his parents, and I were all in immediate danger. Michael's first instinct was to call the police, but he realized that he'd obtained the evidence through illegal hacking, and that several local law enforcement officials had connections to the people he was trying to expose. Instead, he decided to warn his family directly and get us all to safety before the planned attacks could take place. Friday evening, March 15th, Michael called his parents and told them that they needed to cancel their planned weekend trip to visit me. He couldn't explain why over the phone, but he told them that he'd learned about a serious threat and that they needed to leave Seattle immediately and go stay with his father's brother in Vancouver. His parents, confused but trusting Michael's judgment, agreed to leave that night. Then Michael tried to call me to warn me to leave my house immediately. But I wasn't answering my phone because I'd turned it off early and gone to bed with a headache after spending the day working in my garden. Michael tried calling several times, but when he couldn't reach me, he realized that I might already be in danger. The plan he'd intercepted suggested that the attacks were supposed to happen that night, starting with a house fire that would kill me and destroy any evidence I might have hidden in my home. That's when Michael sent the text that saved my life. "Grandma, get out now." The buzzing of my phone at 11:47 p.m. pulled me from the deepest sleep I'd had in weeks. My first thought was that something had happened to one of my children. When you're 73 years old, late-night phone calls rarely bring good news. I fumbled for my reading glasses and squinted at the screen through bleary eyes. Michael's name appeared above 4 words that made my heart stop. "Grandma, get out now." My hands were shaking as I tried to call him back, but the call went straight to voicemail. I tried again with the same result. A dozen terrible possibilities raced through my mind. Was Michael hurt? Was someone in his house? Had something happened to Sarah and her husband? I threw on my bathrobe and slippers, my mind still foggy from sleep but increasingly filled with dread. Then my phone buzzed again. This time it was a longer message from Michael. "House fire planned tonight. They know about Grandpa's investigation. Car parked across street for 3 hours. Get out and drive to Monroe. Hide until I call." I looked out my bedroom window and felt my stomach drop. There was indeed a dark sedan parked across the street, positioned so the driver could watch my house. I'd never seen that car in the neighborhood before, and at nearly midnight on a quiet residential street, There was no innocent reason for someone to be sitting there. My 73-year-old brain struggled to process what Michael was telling me. House fire planned tonight. They know about Grandpa's investigation. The research project I'd thought was innocent family history had somehow put my life in danger. But Michael's tone wasn't that of a panicked teenager. His messages were clear, specific, urgent. He was telling me to run, and something in my gut told me I needed to listen. I moved away from the window and tried to think clearly. If someone really was planning to burn down my house with me in it, I had maybe minutes to escape before they made their move. I couldn't take time to pack properly or gather important documents. I needed to grab the essentials and get out immediately. I threw on jeans and a sweater over my nightgown, grabbed my purse and car keys, and stuffed my feet into tennis shoes. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely tie the laces. As I moved through my house in the darkness, every creak of the floorboards sounded impossibly loud. I kept expecting to hear someone trying to break in, or to smell smoke, or to see flames starting to flicker somewhere. The back door seemed like my safest exit, since it would put my car between me and the sedan parked out front. I eased the door open as quietly as possible and crept across my backyard toward the detached garage. The night air was cold against my face, and I realized I was holding my breath as I tried to walk silently across the gravel driveway. My car, a 10-year-old Honda Civic, had never seemed more precious than it did at that moment. I managed to get inside and close the door with barely a sound, then sat there for a moment, trying to calm my racing heart. The sedan was still visible through my rearview mirror, a dark shadow against the streetlight. Whoever was in that car was definitely watching my house. I turned the key as gently as possible, hoping the engine wouldn't be too loud in the quiet neighborhood. The Honda started with its usual reliable purr, and I backed slowly out of the garage with my headlights off. Only when I reached the end of my street did I turn on the lights and allow myself to breathe normally. Monroe was about 20 minutes away, a small town even quieter than Riverside Heights. I drove there in a state of controlled panic, checking my mirrors constantly to see if anyone was following me. Every set of headlights that appeared behind me made my pulse spike, but no one seemed to be tracking my route. By the time I reached Monroe, it was almost 12:30 a.m., and the streets were completely empty. I parked at a 24-hour diner called Mel's that I remembered from years past, somewhere I could wait safely with other people around and try to figure out what was happening. The waitress looked at me strangely when I came in wearing jeans under my bathrobe, but she didn't comment. I ordered coffee and tried Michael's number again. This time he answered on the first ring. "Grandma, thank God, are you okay? Are you out of the house?" "I'm in Monroe at Mel's Diner," I whispered, even though there was no one close enough to overhear. "Michael, what is going on? You said something about a house fire and your grandfather's investigation. I don't understand." "Grandma, I found out that the research I've been doing, the stuff about Grandpa's old stories, it's bigger than I thought. Much bigger. The people he was investigating in 1994, they're still around, and they've been stealing money from the city for 30 years. Millions of dollars." Michael's voice was tight with fear and excitement. "I hacked into some emails between Thomas Ridley and Mayor Morse and some other guy named Frank Delano. They were planning to kill you tonight to make it look like an accident. They were going to burn down your house with you in it." The words hit me like a physical blow. Someone had been planning to murder me in my sleep, to burn me alive in the house where David and I had raised our children. "Michael, are you sure about this? This sounds like something from a movie." "I'm sure, Grandma. I have copies of the emails. They also planned to kill my parents and me, make it all look like accidents so no one would connect the deaths. Mom and Dad are safe. I got them to leave Seattle tonight and go stay with Uncle Pete in Vancouver. But Grandma, this is real. These people have been covering up corruption for decades, and they'll do whatever it takes to keep their secrets." I sat in that fluorescent-lit diner at 1 a.m., clutching my coffee cup and trying to accept that my quiet suburban life had suddenly become a thriller novel. What do we do now? Do we call the police? "That's complicated," Michael said. "Some of the local police have connections to these people. Frank Delano has been paying off city officials for years, and that probably includes law enforcement. But I've been in contact with an FBI agent in Seattle who specializes in municipal corruption, Agent Jennifer Torres. She's been investigating similar cases throughout the Pacific Northwest, and when I showed her what I'd found, she said it fits a pattern she's been tracking." Michael had been in contact with the FBI. My 17-year-old grandson had uncovered a criminal conspiracy and was working with federal agents. I felt proud and terrified in equal measure. When did you contact the FBI? 3 days ago, when I first intercepted those emails about the plan to kill us. Agent Torres said she's been looking for exactly this kind of evidence for months. There have been rumors about corruption in Riverside Heights and several other cities, but no one could prove anything until I found the financial connections and the email communications. So what happens now? Agent Torres is driving down from Seattle tonight with a team. They're going to arrest Thomas Ridley, Mayor Morse, Frank Delano, and several other people involved in the conspiracy. But they needed to make sure you were safe first, because these people were serious about eliminating anyone who could testify against them. As if on cue, my phone began buzzing with a call from an unfamiliar number. Michael told me to answer it, that it would be Agent Torres. Mrs. Chen? This is Special Agent Jennifer Torres, with the FBI. I'm very glad to hear you're safe. Your grandson has provided us with crucial evidence of a long-term corruption scheme involving several city officials and private contractors. Agent Torres had a calm, professional voice that made me feel like I was finally in competent adult hands. We've been monitoring the communications of the suspects since Michael first contacted us, and we intercepted plans for coordinated attacks on you and your family tonight. We have teams moving to arrest the primary suspects as we speak. You mean this is really over? The immediate danger is over, yes. But Mrs. Chen, we're gonna need your help. Michael's research has uncovered evidence of criminal activity dating back 30 years, and some of that evidence involves your late husband's journalism work. We believe David Chen was forced to stop his investigation in 1994 because he was threatened, and we'd like to understand exactly what he discovered and why he was silenced. I thought about David, about how frustrated and angry he'd been when his investigation was shut down, about how he'd never quite been the same after that. Agent Torres, my husband died 28 years ago. I don't know how much help I can be. You'd be surprised. Michael found references in David's notes to sources and documents that were never published. If those materials still exist, they could help us understand the full scope of this conspiracy and ensure that everyone involved is held accountable. Over the next several hours, sitting in that diner in Monroe, I watched my quiet life transform into something I never could have imagined. Agent Torres and her team arrived around 3 a.m., professional and reassuring. They explained that they'd arrested Thomas Ridley at his home, along with Mayor Patricia Morse and Frank Delano. They'd also arrested the 2 men who had been hired to carry out the attacks on my family, Carl Murphy and Steve Bassett, both of whom were found with materials for starting fires and detailed plans of my house. The scheme Michael had uncovered was even larger than he'd initially realized. Over 30 years, the group led by Ridley had stolen an estimated $15 million from various municipal governments. They'd awarded contracts to their own companies, inflated the costs of environmental cleanup projects, and split the profits among a network of conspirators that included city officials, contractors, and business owners throughout the region. David's investigation in 1994 had gotten close enough to the truth that Ridley and his associates had felt threatened. They'd pressured David's editor at the newspaper to kill the story, and when David had refused to back down, they'd threatened his family. David had ultimately abandoned the investigation to protect Sarah, my other children, and me. He'd never told me the real reason he'd stopped pursuing the story, because he hadn't wanted me to live in fear. But David had been smarter than the conspirators realized. He'd hidden copies of his research, his interview notes, and supporting documents in a safety deposit box that I'd inherited after his death but had never opened. I'd assumed it contained insurance papers and other routine documents. Michael and I had been planning to go through it during his next visit as part of his family history project. When Agent Torres and I opened that safety deposit box the following week, we found a treasure trove of evidence that David had preserved for nearly 3 decades. Financial records, photographs of documents, recorded interviews with sources, and detailed notes about the connections between city officials and private contractors. David had documented everything, even after he'd been forced to stop publishing his findings. Most remarkably, we found a letter David had written to me to be opened only if something happened to him or if the corruption he'd uncovered ever came to light again. In that letter, he explained everything he'd learned, everything he'd been forced to hide, and his hope that someday the truth would be revealed and the people responsible would be held accountable. "My dear Margaret," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means the story I couldn't tell has finally come to light. I pray that it's because justice has finally caught up with these people, and not because they've hurt our family to keep their secrets." Reading David's words 28 years after his death, understanding for the first time why he'd seemed so defeated and angry during his final years, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Grief for the husband who'd carried this burden alone, pride in the grandson who'd finished his grandfather's work, and satisfaction that the truth was finally being revealed. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and lengthy. Michael's research and David's hidden evidence formed the foundation of a federal case that ultimately sent Thomas Ridley, Patricia Morse, Frank Delano, and 12 other co-conspirators to prison, for terms ranging from 5 to 20 years. The cities and towns they'd defrauded recovered most of the stolen money, and several environmental cleanup projects that had been deliberately botched were finally completed properly. Michael became something of a celebrity in investigative journalism circles. His combination of computer skills, analytical thinking, and determination had broken open a case that law enforcement had been struggling with for years. He was interviewed by newspapers and television stations, and several universities tried to recruit him, even though he'd already committed to MIT. But the real vindication came 6 months after that terrifying night in March, when the city of Riverside Heights held a public ceremony to honor David Chen's journalism, and to acknowledge that his investigation had been suppressed by corrupt officials. The current city council, most of whose members had been elected after the corruption scandal broke, formally apologized for the city's role in silencing David's reporting. They also announced that the main branch of the Riverside Heights Public Library would be renamed the David Chen Memorial Library, and that a journalism scholarship would be established in his memory for students interested in investigative reporting. Standing at that ceremony, watching Michael accept the scholarship award on his grandfather's behalf, I felt a profound sense of completion. David's work had finally been recognized. The criminals he tried to expose had been brought to justice, and his grandson had proven that courage and determination could triumph over corruption and intimidation. Michael started at MIT that fall, majoring in computer science with a focus on digital forensics and cybersecurity. He decided that he wanted to use technology to help law enforcement and journalists uncover corruption and hold powerful people accountable. Agent Torres had offered to help him get internships with the FBI's cybercrime unit, and several news organizations had expressed interest in his skills. As for me, I moved out of the house on Maple Street. Too many memories, both good and bad, were tied up in those walls. I found a smaller place, closer to Seattle, where I could see Michael and Sarah more regularly. The new house has a garden, though not as elaborate as the one David started 40 years ago. I'm 74 now, and I've learned that life can change dramatically when you least expect it. People often ask me if I regret that Michael pursued his investigation despite the danger it created for our family. The answer is always no. David spent the last 28 years of his life knowing that criminals were profiting from their crimes while good people suffered from their corruption. Michael gave him justice, even if David wasn't alive to see it. I also learned something important about underestimating people based on their age or experience. Sarah had dismissed Michael's computer research as teenage obsession, just like my family in the wedding story had dismissed the older woman's business ambitions. But Michael's youth and technological skills were exactly what was needed to uncover a conspiracy that had been hidden for 3 decades. The real lesson, I think, is that truth has a way of surfacing eventually, no matter how powerful the people who try to bury it. David planted seeds of justice in 1994 that didn't bloom until 2024, but they did bloom. Michael watered those seeds with his curiosity, his courage, and his refusal to accept that some questions shouldn't be asked. These days, when my phone buzzes late at night, I don't panic. But I do remember that night in March, when 4 words from my grandson saved my life and ultimately brought justice for crimes that had been hidden for 30 years. Sometimes the most important messages come from the people we least expect, at the moments when we most need to hear them. The house fire that was supposed to kill me never happened, of course. Carl Murphy and Steve Bassett were arrested before they could carry out their plan. But driving past my old house a few months later, I noticed that the new owners had installed a sophisticated security system and outdoor lighting. Some threats, once you know they exist, change how you see the world forever. Michael visits me regularly at my new house, and we often talk about his grandfather and the investigation that connected 3 generations of our family. David started the work, Michael finished it, and I lived to see justice done. Not every family gets that kind of closure, and I don't take it for granted. The corruption conspiracy that nearly cost me my life had one final ironic twist. When federal investigators calculated the total amount of money that had been stolen over 30 years, they determined that Thomas Ridley and his associates had taken almost exactly $15 million from various municipal governments. David's original investigation in 1994, if it had been allowed to continue, would have exposed theft of maybe $50,000 and prevented decades of additional crimes. By silencing David to protect their small-scale corruption, the conspirators had enabled a much larger criminal enterprise that ultimately led to much more serious consequences for everyone involved. Their success in 1994 had made them overconfident, sloppy, and ultimately vulnerable to a teenager with a laptop and his grandfather's sense of justice. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Michael had been a different kind of teenager, one who wasn't interested in computers or family history. The corruption might have continued for another 30 years, and no one would have been held accountable for David's suppressed investigation or the millions of dollars in theft. But Michael was exactly the right person at exactly the right time, with exactly the right combination of skills and motivation to finish the work his grandfather had started. Agent Torres told me later that Michael's case had become a model for how technology could be used to uncover long-term corruption schemes. The FBI was training agents to look for the kind of digital connections and financial patterns that Michael had identified, and several other cities were being investigated based on similar evidence. The ripple effects of that terrifying night in March continued for years, as more corruption came to light and more criminals were held accountable. David's journalism had always been about making sure that powerful people couldn't abuse their positions without consequences. Michael had taken that mission into the digital age, where the tools for uncovering truth were more powerful but the stakes were often higher. I kept the letter David had written to me, the one I'd found in the safety deposit box. Sometimes I read it when I'm missing him, or when I need to remember that justice, though it may be delayed, is not always denied. His words remind me that he never stopped believing that the truth would eventually come out, and that the people responsible would eventually be held accountable. The story will tell itself eventually, quote. He'd written, "Truth has a way of surfacing when the time is right and when the right person is ready to tell it." Michael was that person, and that night in March was the right time. 4 words sent from a teenager's cell phone had saved my life and brought justice for crimes that had been hidden since before he was born. Sometimes the most important stories take decades to unfold, but they're worth the wait when truth finally wins. The months following the arrests brought changes I never could have anticipated. My quiet life in Riverside Heights had been shattered, but what emerged from the pieces was something richer and more meaningful than I'd ever imagined possible at my age. The media attention was overwhelming at first. Local news stations wanted to interview me about surviving an attempted murder. National publications wanted to write about the grandmother whose family history project uncovered municipal corruption, and true crime podcasters kept calling to ask if I'd appear on their shows. I declined most of these requests, but I did agree to speak with a reporter from the Portland Tribune, the same newspaper where David had worked all those years ago. The interview was conducted by a young woman named Amanda Rodriguez, who had been covering municipal politics for about 5 years. She was thorough and respectful, asking thoughtful questions about David's original investigation and how it felt to learn that his work had finally been vindicated. But what struck me most about Amanda was how familiar her approach seemed. She had the same careful attention to detail, the same persistent curiosity about inconsistencies and connections that I remembered from David's work. After the interview was published, Amanda stayed in touch with me. She was working on a longer investigative piece about patterns of municipal corruption throughout Oregon, and she wanted to understand how the Riverside Heights conspiracy fit into a broader network of similar schemes. The more she researched, the more she discovered that Thomas Ridley's operation was part of a much larger web of corruption that extended across multiple states. Amanda's investigation revealed that Ridley had connections to similar operations in Washington, Idaho, and Northern California. Environmental consulting companies in those states had been using the same playbook. awarding inflated contracts to connected businesses, creating fake emergencies that required expensive remediation, and splitting the profits among networks of corrupt officials and contractors. The total amount of money involved was staggering, potentially over $100 million across all the connected schemes. What made Amanda's reporting particularly powerful was that she had access to David's original research notes, which I'd shared with her after getting permission from the FBI. David had been tracking some of the same interstate connections back in 1994, but without modern technology and databases, he hadn't been able to see the full scope of what was happening. His notes contained names and business relationships that proved crucial to understanding how the corruption network had evolved over 3 decades. The series of articles Amanda published over the following year won her a Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting. During her acceptance speech, she credited David Chen with laying the groundwork for her investigation and mentioned that his suppressed reporting from 1994 had provided the foundation for exposing one of the largest municipal corruption schemes in Pacific Northwest history. Watching Amanda accept that award, I felt a profound connection to David's legacy. His journalism career had been cut short. His most important investigation had been silenced, but his work had ultimately contributed to one of the most significant corruption exposés of the modern era. The truth he'd uncovered had waited 30 years to be told, but it had finally found its voice through a combination of his careful documentation, Michael's technological skills, and Amanda's professional expertise. The personal relationships in my family also underwent significant changes during this period. Sarah, who had initially been skeptical of Michael's computer research and worried about his obsessive investigative tendencies, came to understand that his skills and instincts had literally saved our lives. She began to see his technological interests not as unhealthy isolation, but as valuable tools that could be used for important purposes. More significantly, Sarah started asking questions about her father that she'd never asked before. She'd been only 10 years old when David died, and her memories of him were mostly of a loving father who read her bedtime stories and helped her with homework. She'd never really understood what his work as a journalist had involved, or why he'd sometimes seemed so frustrated and angry during his final years. Learning about David's suppressed investigation and the threats that had forced him to abandon it gave Sarah a new perspective on her father's character and career. She began to understand that his journalism hadn't just been a job, but a calling to hold powerful people accountable for their actions. His decision to stop investigating the corruption in 1994 hadn't been professional weakness, but paternal love, a sacrifice he'd made to protect his family. Sarah started visiting me more regularly, bringing old photo albums and asking me to tell her stories about her father's reporting adventures. We spent hours going through his old files and notes, piecing together the story of his career and the cases he'd worked on. For the first time since David's death, I felt like I could talk openly about the man he'd been. Not just the father and husband, but the journalist who'd believed deeply in the importance of truth and accountability. One of the most touching moments came when Sarah found a letter David had written to her on her 8th birthday, a letter that had been tucked away in his desk drawer and forgotten for decades. In it, he'd written about his hopes for her future, and his belief that she would grow up to be someone who stood up for what was right, even when it was difficult or dangerous. "My dear Sarah," the letter read, "I hope that when you're old enough to understand, you'll see that the most important thing in life is to use whatever talents and opportunities you have to make the world a little bit better. Sometimes that means asking hard questions that people don't want to answer. Sometimes it means standing up to powerful people who would rather keep their secrets hidden. But if you have the courage to seek truth and defend justice, you'll be living a life that matters." Reading David's words to his 8-year-old daughter, knowing that she was now 34, and watching her teenage son carry on his grandfather's mission, I felt the profound continuity of values passing between generations. David's belief in justice had skipped a generation, lying dormant during Sarah's childhood and young adulthood, but had re-emerged in Michael's determination to finish his grandfather's work. The legal proceedings continued for more than a year, with multiple trials for different defendants and different aspects of the conspiracy. I testified several times, describing what I knew about David's original investigation and the contents of the safety deposit box. The experience of testifying in federal court was intimidating at first, but I found that telling the truth, even about painful and complicated events, was ultimately liberating. Thomas Ridley's trial was the most significant, since he'd been the central figure in the corruption network for 3 decades. His defense attorneys tried to argue that he'd simply been a successful businessman who'd built good relationships with municipal clients. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. Michael's research had documented hundreds of transactions, contracts, and communications that clearly showed a pattern of fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. The most damaging evidence came from Ridley's own emails and financial records, which showed that he'd been systematically overcharging cities for environmental services, creating fake emergencies that required expensive remediation, and splitting the profits with corrupt officials. In some cases, Ridley's company had been paid to clean up environmental problems that didn't actually exist, generating millions of dollars in fraudulent billings. During Ridley's trial, prosecutors also presented evidence about the planned attacks on my family. Carl Murphy and Steve Bassett had already pled guilty to conspiracy to commit murder, and their testimony revealed the full scope of what Ridley and his associates had been willing to do to protect their criminal enterprise. The plan hadn't just been to kill Michael, his parents, and me. They'd also intended to destroy all physical and digital evidence of the corruption, including David's hidden research materials and Michael's computer files. The revelation that Ridley had been willing to commit multiple murders to hide financial crimes shocked even the experienced prosecutors handling the case. During the sentencing hearing, the federal judge commented that the conspiracy represented not just theft of public money, but a fundamental attack on democratic governance and the rule of law. "Mr. Ridley," the judge said, "your crimes went far beyond stealing money from taxpayers. You corrupted the basic processes of local government, you silenced a journalist who was trying to inform the public about wrongdoing, and you planned to murder innocent people to hide your crimes. This represents the kind of corruption that undermines citizens, faith in their institutions, and threatens the foundations of democratic society." Ridley was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison, the longest sentence of any of the conspirators. Mayor Patricia Morse received 15 years, and Frank Delano got 18 years. The other defendants, mostly lower-level participants who had helped facilitate the corruption or had taken bribes, received sentences ranging from 2 to 10 years. The financial restitution was almost as satisfying as the prison sentences. The cities and towns that had been defrauded recovered nearly all of the stolen money, plus interest and penalties. Riverside Heights alone recovered over $2 million, money that was used to upgrade the city's water treatment facilities and to establish an oversight system designed to prevent future corruption. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The Society of Professional Journalists, the nation's oldest organization dedicated to journalism ethics and press freedom, decided to posthumously award David Chen their Medal for Courage in Journalism. The award recognized journalists who had faced significant personal or professional risks in pursuit of important stories. The ceremony was held in Portland, at the same hotel where David and I had celebrated our 20th wedding anniversary. Michael accompanied me to the event, wearing his grandfather's old tie and carrying a folder containing some of David's original investigation notes. The Society's president spoke about the importance of journalists who were willing to challenge powerful interests, even when doing so came at great personal cost. "David Chen represents the best tradition of American journalism," she said. "He pursued an important story, despite pressure from powerful interests. He documented his findings carefully and thoroughly, and he preserved evidence for future investigators, even after he was forced to stop publishing. His work ultimately contributed to one of the most significant corruption investigations in recent memory, proving that truth, though it may be delayed, will eventually emerge." When Michael accepted the medal on his grandfather's behalf, he spoke about the importance of curiosity, persistence, and courage in seeking truth. He talked about how his grandfather's example had inspired his own research, and how the tools and techniques of investigation had evolved over the decades, but the fundamental mission remained the same. "My grandfather taught me that journalism isn't just about writing stories," Michael said. "It's about asking the questions that need to be asked, even when powerful people don't want to answer them. It's about remembering that democracy depends on an informed citizenry, and that an informed citizenry depends on journalists who are willing to dig for the truth, even when that truth is buried under decades of corruption and cover-ups." The audience gave Michael a standing ovation, and I found myself crying as I watched this 17-year-old young man, who 6 months earlier had been dismissed as a teenager with an unhealthy computer obsession, being recognized by professional journalists as someone who had made a significant contribution to their field. After the ceremony, several journalism schools approached Michael about scholarships and special programs. The Columbia Graduate School of Journalism offered him a guaranteed spot in their program after he completed his undergraduate degree at MIT. The Nieman Foundation at Harvard invited him to participate in their summer program for young journalists. The Washington Post offered him internships for each of his college summers. But the offer that meant the most to Michael came from Amanda Rodriguez and the Portland Tribune. They wanted him to work as a part-time digital investigation consultant while he was in college, helping them apply technological tools to investigative journalism projects. The job would allow him to continue the kind of work that had exposed the Riverside Heights corruption, while also learning from experienced professional journalists. Michael accepted the offer with the Tribune, seeing it as a way to honor his grandfather's legacy while building his own career. His first assignment was to help Amanda investigate a similar pattern of corruption in municipal governments throughout the Pacific Northwest, using the same techniques he'd developed while researching his family history. As I watched Michael begin this new phase of his life, I realized that the terrifying night in March had not just saved my life and brought justice for old crimes. It had also set in motion a chain of events that would influence the next generation of investigative journalism, as Michael's technological skills and ethical foundation combined to create new possibilities for holding powerful people accountable. The house on Maple Street, where I'd lived for 46 years, was eventually sold to a young family with 2 small children. Before I moved out, I walked through each room one last time, remembering the life David and I had built there, the children we'd raised, and the secrets that had been hidden in that safety deposit box for nearly 3 decades. In David's old home office, I found one last item that I'd missed during previous cleanings. Tucked behind his desk was a small notebook containing what appeared to be personal reflections about his journalism career. Most of the entries were brief observations about stories he was working on or people he'd interviewed, but one entry, dated just a few months before his death, stood out. "The hardest part of being a journalist," David had written, "is not the long hours or the difficult sources or even the threats from powerful people who don't want their secrets exposed. The hardest part is knowing that some stories are too dangerous to tell, that some truths are too costly to reveal. But I have faith that truth has its own timeline, that the evidence I've gathered will someday serve justice, even if I'm not around to see it." Reading those words in David's handwriting, sitting in the office where he'd spent so many evenings working on stories that would never be published, I understood that he'd always known his investigation might remain unfinished. But he'd also believed that the truth would eventually emerge, that someone would someday pick up where he'd been forced to leave off, that someone had turned out to be his grandson, a teenager with computer skills that David couldn't have imagined, working with tools that didn't exist in 1994. But the fundamental mission was the same, using careful research, persistent questioning, and moral courage to ensure that powerful people couldn't abuse their positions without consequences. As I locked the door to the house on Maple Street for the last time, I thought about the strange ways that stories unfold across generations, how seeds planted in one era can bloom decades later, in circumstances no one could have predicted. David's journalism had been silenced in 1994, but it had ultimately contributed to bringing down a corruption network that had been operating for 30 years. His grandson had finished the work he'd started, using different tools but guided by the same principles. The new chapter of my life, beginning at age 74, was filled with possibilities I'd never imagined. I was no longer just a widow living quietly in a small town, but someone who had survived an attempted murder, contributed to a major corruption investigation, and helped preserve the legacy of journalism that believed in the power of truth to overcome injustice. Sometimes the most important stories in our lives don't unfold the way we expect them to. Sometimes they take 30 years to reach their conclusion, involving people and technologies that didn't exist when the story began. But if we're patient enough and brave enough to let those stories tell themselves, they can change the world in ways we never anticipated. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.